We answer Reload member questions on the NFA tax cut, DOJ Second Amendment maneuvering, and Supreme Court inaction. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Katowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news reporting and analysis instead of opinion and speculation. That's what we see a lot elsewhere. We try to be informed and independent here at The Reload, and that is how we try to deliver the news to you guys. This week, we are catching up on some questions and answers that have been submitted by Reload members. The Reload, as I mentioned there, is independent, which means it is funded entirely by the dues from our members. And so one of the perks of membership is that you get to ask the questions when we do our Q&A podcast. And so this is one of those episodes. We got a lot to talk about. We had actually one of the first pieces of federal gun legislation that loosens federal gun restrictions in a generation, you could say. I mean, it certainly was not what gun rights activists wanted it to be. They did not get everything that they had hoped for, that Republicans had put in the bill initially. And so there's actually quite a lot of disappointment around this, but it is a substantial change to the National Firearms Act. And we actually have a bunch of questions on that, but we've also got a lot going on with the Supreme Court, with DOJ, how they're approaching Second Amendment litigation. A lot of good questions. The market, questions about the gun market, but to answer a number of those, I've got with me here contributor writer for The Reload, Jake Fogleman. How you doing today, Jake?
Doing good, Stephen. Always love doing these Q&A episodes. It's been a little while, but it's always good to hear from the members and chat with them about what's going on with guns.
And they always have, I find, really good questions, really like informed questions. They're not coming in totally beginner style, no idea what's going on sort of questions. We get really good, deep, interesting questions. And so we have a number of those to answer. I'm coming to you from the farm this week. I'm up here watching my mom's horse farm in Pennsylvania. So that's why the background and audio might be a little bit different from what you're used to. But, the horses are out in the field. And right now, everything is going well now. It's going to be a little hot today, so I'll have to bring them in to the barn so they don't get too sweaty out there in the field. But for now, we've got time to do this Q&A. So let's start off with the first question here that comes to us from Ken. And we're starting off with we'll just ease into this because, this deals with that NFA, National Firearms tax cut that was in the budget bill. And it deals with the question, some of the consequences of that, right? There was a whole political fight over what would end up in here. And all that got through was the tax cut. It zeroed out the tax, the NFA tax stamp on silencers and suppressors, short barrel rifles and shotguns, and what are called any other weapons. So generally that's guns that are designed to look like something else, disguised firearms, like a cane gun or a pen gun or something like that. That's what's in that category. And so all those now have had the tax cut from $200 per item down to $0. And so Ken has a question, says and this doesn't start until January 2026 is when this all goes into effect. So for now, nothing has actually changed today on how the NFA works. But in 2026, Ken asks, if I build an SBR, a short barrel rifle, and no taxes due, do I need to register it? He says, if I purchase it from an FFL with a 4473, the background check, that's actually from the Brady law, but he understands that he has to register in that case. But what about home built SBRs? Do you want to take that one real quick?
Sure. Yeah. Just short answer. Yes, you still need to register it. Cause like you said, the only thing that actually made it through in the end was just the tax cut. And so even though it is a $0 tax now, it's no longer $200. You still need to register it, which is, it's kind of, I understand why he's asking this question, because the registry is technically proof of paying the tax, and you're no longer paying the tax. So I get why it's confusing, but the registry portion of the law is still intact. It did not make it through the reconciliation process. So you still do need to register.
Yeah, so the way to think of it right now is that you're still paying the tax. It's just that the tax is $0. And I know that sounds absurd because it is, but that's how the law is structured. It's now you pay this tax, the tax for certain items, not all NFA items, right? The machine guns and destructive devices are still taxed at $200 rate. And the cut on any other weapons, I think they were only at $5 to begin with.
Right. Yeah.
So you're only getting like a $5 discount there, to be fair. But yeah, and also, while the law, what ended up in the law being signed by President Trump was much less than what the most expansive version of this bill was at some point, once it was in the Senate. Because that included delisting of these items, which would have taken them out and you wouldn't have had to register them or comply with any of the other regulations involved there. The final bill did actually have an effect on making registration. So if you make your own SBR like this gentleman, or you make your own suppressor or AOW or whatever, the tax will still apply, but it'll be cut down to zero. Initially, out of the House Ways and Means Committee, they had the tax only cut on transfers. So if you went and bought one from a dealer, essentially, and the making tax was still at $200, and it didn't apply to short barrel rifles initially either. So while the end result was not what gun rights groups wanted, certainly, and you've seen a lot of anger over this, and understandably so to some degree. Now, some of it I think is based on a misunderstanding of what was reality, what was really going to happen, or the likelihood that they were going to get some of this stuff through, as we've discussed. And that's where independent media like The Reload, I think, comes into play, because we can tell you from a more objective point of view what is likely to happen. Not that we're always right or anything, but we do our best to provide strong analysis on this. And I think in this case, we did a really good job of informing our readers where things were actually going and what was realistic and what wasn't, or at least what you should expect could happen, which is exactly what did happen, which is the delisting got stripped out in the Senate by the parliamentarian because it didn't comply with the reconciliation rules. We're getting really deep into this, maybe too deep for the question that we're answering here. But just point is, it didn't, at the end of the day, they didn't get delisting, which is what gun rights advocates wanted very much in this bill. But they did actually still get some expansion from the proposal that had started in the House, which was just cutting the tax and only on transfers and only on suppressors. So it did end up where they cut the tax on SBRs and on homemade SBRs, but at the end of the day, as you mentioned, to answer the relatively straightforward question, you still have to go through the registration process, even if you're making your own, just like you did before, or just like you would right now. After this tax cut comes in, you're still going to have to pay for it. Now, getting back, because this will transition into the next part of Ken's question. As we mentioned, it's kind of an absurd situation where you're paying $0, but you have to register the item to show that you paid that $0 tax. And so the absurdity of that has not gone unnoticed by gun rights advocates who believe that it is grounds to challenge at least these sections of the National Firearms Act as unconstitutional, because they no longer are justified through Congress's taxing power, because the NFA was justified as a tax when it was passed through Congress in 1934, and was also upheld as an exercise of Congress's taxing power by the Supreme Court in a 1937 case. And so the argument goes, well, because the tax, insofar as it exists, doesn't actually try to collect revenue anymore because it's set at $0, it's not a lawful exercise of Congress's taxing power, and therefore it's unconstitutional. That's what we're seeing from the GOA lawsuit that we profiled recently and went through and explained their arguments. And so there is a challenge to this based off of the cut, and which was something I think that was always part of the plan here, that gun rights advocates and Republicans understood that was a potential outcome of cutting the tax to $0, that it would weaken it in court. And so as soon as the bill was signed into law, the GOA filed their lawsuit, and we're going to have another lawsuit from a collection of other gun rights groups, including the National Rifle Association and Second Amendment Foundation, Firearms Policy Coalition, and American Suppressor Association. We don't have the text of that one yet, but we will soon, presumably. Although it's not clear yet when they're going to release. I don't think they've said if they're waiting for the law to go into effect, but that's what the question we have here from Ken is. He says, "You do not have standing. I've heard this many times. The big, beautiful bill eliminates the $200 tax, but not until January 1st, 2026. So how can lawsuits be filed now, if they don't have standing until the law takes effect? Am I missing a piece of information on that front?" So he's asking here, GOA has already filed their lawsuit alongside, a number of other gun companies and gun rights groups, and industry groups. FRAC is one of them, and I think Silencer Shops Foundation is part in there. It's a coalition. They've already filed. The law's not in effect yet. How can they do that? Right? Is the basic question.
Yeah, this gets into sort of the wonky area of pre-enforcement challenges and lawsuits that, to this listener's point, has come up quite a bit in gun rights lawsuits that we've covered over the years as well.
Yes.
And, one caveat, we're not lawyers here, so don't take this as pure, the advice of a legal expert. But
and I think people can often disagree on it too. Like you've seen gun rights groups in the past argue over when the right time to file the case is, pre-enforcement or after it goes into effect, and when you have a better chance. But you can't file pre-enforcement ones is sort of the point.
And then judges, like to your point, there's multiple opinions among judges too, because you've seen judges toss things for standing that other courts have ruled on as, okay to give a ruling on, a block preliminarily or what have you. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot. I think it probably depends on the particular court where the lawsuit is filed in. They probably have their own standing precedent within those courts as to when they can actually rule on something like this. So I don't think we know for sure whether or not it's going to work. He raises a good point about how can you file something before it's gone into effect? How can you show you've been harmed by a law that is not currently being enforced? You've seen that come up in a lot of gun rights lawsuits. So it's an open question, I would say.
Yeah, and often you'll see in Second Amendment cases like this one, a lot of the arguments will be around irreparable harm because it's a constitutional right would be violated by the law being enforced, and that's usually how the argument goes. And whether or not it works is another question. And also, as you mentioned, standing can be determined differently in different courts. Different circuits will look at the same, these same questions and come to different conclusions. That's it's kind of how the system is designed to work. And then ultimately, the Supreme Court is supposed to mediate any disagreements between the lower circuits. That's supposed to be their role most of the time. And so, bottom line is it depends on where you're filing. This GOA case was filed in the Fifth Circuit, which is largely viewed to be the most conservative circuit in the country, and probably the most likely to look favorably on how GOA is arguing this case. But interestingly, we did a analysis piece where we talked to a lot of experts, Second Amendment experts, practicing lawyers and scholars on the GOA case and the basic arguments in it and what they thought would be the strengths and weaknesses of it and how it might turn out. And standing was an issue that several of the experts brought up as a potential weak point for this GOA suit as one of the hurdles they're going to have to overcome is proving that they have been harmed and that the harm is, directly connected to the government's action here. Because, and especially if you're trying to get something like a preliminary injunction that blocks the law before it goes into effect, and while the case is ongoing, being litigated, because what's happened or what is going to happen is actually going to make the burden on someone owning these guns lighter, because it's cutting the financial burden of the $200 tax. Now, obviously, the question here is more about Congress's power to impose these sorts of NFA restrictions, and whether it's, can you justify all the NFA requirements under the idea that it's an exercise of Congress's taxing power when they're not trying to collect revenue, at least in this section of the law. There's a lot of that piece goes much more in depth, and has a number of experts that come down on either side of the question. So it's not all one view or the other. That's what we try to give people a variety of views from respected scholars on either side of the issue, so you're not surprised if something goes one way or the other. You have never heard the counter argument to that's the goal with what we're trying to do with those pieces. But yeah, that standing did come up, not so much in this way of pre-enforcement versus post-enforcement. It came up more in the regards to like being able to show that there's enough harm being done to the plaintiffs to actually get standing to sue in court. That was the more often cited weakness or potential issue for the GOA suit. So we'll have to see how a court reacts, especially, they filed in the circuit that makes the most sense for them to file in. If you're picking a circuit to try and get a pro-Second Amendment ruling, a pro-gun ruling, that would be the Fifth Circuit to start with. So we'll see how a judge reacts to it there. But yeah. Next question. Again, dealing with these NFA changes, but from a different point of view now. We have a question from William, and he says, it's probably too early to tell, but how did the NFA changes, including the reconciliation bill, impact donations to both the pro-gun control groups as well as the pro-gun rights groups? Both have used these changes to heavily market for donations. It is too early to tell, I think, would be the first thing to say. Like as far as hard numbers and stuff that you can look at and say, okay, we know exactly how this, what donations look like in the wake of this law passing. We're not going to get that kind of stuff for a while. Probably another year before you'll start to see those 990s that these groups have to publish, the public records that they have to publish of their financials. And even then, you're not necessarily going to see like a breakout of, the big fundraising haul happened the day after the president, July 5th, right? The day after this was signed into law. But we can probably speculate a little bit on how it's impacting things, right? There's some basics, I think, patterns that you can look at in political activism and funding for it, and how that tends to play out generally, not necessarily specific to this exact moment or this exact bill. One thing I will say is the general public probably has no idea that any of this has happened, right? Like, the National Firearms Act is not something I think most people know about, and honestly, not even most gun owners. It's something that a lot enthusiasts care a great deal about, probably more so on the gun owner, gun rights side than on the gun control side. But certainly, it's not something that is likely to gin up a huge wave of donations one way or the other to either side. Just because I don't think most people have even heard that there was a cut to the NFA tax, or would even know what that means or would entail, especially because there's so much else in the bill that got way more attention, the Medicaid cuts and the SALT deduction was a big fight, right? There's so much else going on in there. The Rural Hospitals Fund and all these other things that are top of mind if somebody is paying attention to the budget bill generally, which most people probably aren't paying close attention to most budget bills. But the silencer tax cut in there is going to be down the list as far as what got coverage and what people are aware of. So it's probably only having a major effect on enthusiasts, like hardcore people, like people who are hardcore following along with these issues. And now those certainly would also be the kind of people who would make up the donor lists of gun groups, to be fair. I do think one of the problems for the gun rights side, at least, is that the way they played this politically ended up making the outcome look like a political loss for them, right? I mean, that's how it's been framed for the most part from a lot of these groups, like that, because they wanted more, right? They wanted full delisting. They didn't get that. And then they wanted like the Senate parliamentarian fired, which was even more unrealistic, frankly, than getting full delisting through the reconciliation process. They didn't get that. They didn't come close to getting that, honestly. And now they're left in a situation where it seems like a political loss. And I don't know, you're not going to get a lot of donors excited to give you money if you're framing how this all played out as a loss for you and your movement. That's my first impression of it. It's also just like goes back to kind of the base level problem that you have if you're a gun rights group right now, which is that the party that you're aligned with is in power. And that usually means that your donor base and gun owners in this case are going to feel less urgency to donate to you because they're going to feel less vulnerable to new restrictions being put in place. And so I think you're headed into an environment here where fundraising is going to be more difficult than it was in the Biden years, for instance. And not that that's unique to the gun space. That happens, I think, across the board in all kinds of activism. When the party you're aligned with is in power, your donor base is going to feel less urgency to fund the fight, right? Now, if your policy is at the center of the political moment, maybe you can generate enthusiasm to get things done, perhaps. But I think usually, the effect that's more common, I think, is the party in power and the groups associated with them, the interest groups associated with them, have a harder time raising money and ginning up enthusiasm for their cause because people feel less threatened that a negative outcome is going to happen. And so on the other side, in theory at least, the gun control group should see the opposite effect. They should see a more enthused base. They should see more money coming in because their donor base is going to feel threatened by the moment because their political adversaries are in power, which means they may enact things that they don't like. Now, there is a counterpoint to this, I guess, right, Jacob? We did see a prominent gun control group have to do a bunch of layoffs, right? Shortly after the election, which goes against this general theme I'm talking about here, right? March for Our Lives, if you recall, they had a bunch of layoffs, right?
I would say we reported that shortly, like you said, after the election, the re-election of Donald Trump, where they fairly quietly put out a basically indication that I think almost like 90% of their staff had to be let go. I think there's only like one or two staffers left. And to be fair, that's a group that really never rivaled its peak, its post-Parkland peak. If you like follow their financials year after year, they never were even anywhere close to the fundraising haul and activity level that they had in the 2018, 2019 time. But yes, like you said, that is sort of a counterexample of where you would think it would be sort of a ripe opportunity for a gun gun control group or a general progressive issue group to try to make hay out of fighting the Trump administration, and they instead kind of folded up.
Yeah, of course. I guess that happened so fast after the election, and in a time where I think a lot of Democrats and people on the left were very demoralized by the fact that they lost the election to Donald Trump, a second time. And so I think there was a pretty significant lull in that donor enthusiasm. And also, these sorts of effects are more of a general thing, as we're talking about here. And they can be overcome by, the specifics of the organization you're looking at. So like March for Our Lives, as you mentioned, they kind of start off with a huge influx of money. There's also different dynamics to the gun control and gun rights movements and how groups are funded, where, in the gun control space, you have a lot more top heavy groups where, it's one or two really big donors, Michael Bloomberg being the most prominent of all of them. And they provide a bulk of the funding for those groups. And so that can be a problem if, you're, and March for Our Lives is always kind of more of an outsider group. David Hogg is closely associated with it. And he's, as we've seen from, his very short time at the DNC, he's always been sort of an insurgent guy. He wants to, and March for Our Lives, I think, was very similar to that. Like they're not really, like Everytown is much more of a coalition group, of an establishment group that is trying to work with Democratic leadership to get their priorities done or whatever. And March for Our Lives is more the kind of group that would fund insurgent candidates or, highlight outsider, agitators, like that. That was that was more their dynamic. So that can be, I think, harder to sell to really big donors, right? And so there's other dynamics at play here. And March for Our Lives is not a particularly well run organization either. They didn't accomplish outside of the early stages where they had big rallies, back in 2018, 2019. They weren't having the same kind of impact that they did in the very beginning for quite a long time. So it wasn't necessarily that their funding just all dried up after the election, and they still exist and could come back, and maybe they'll see a surge in funding for them and for the other gun control groups. But we won't know for sure, bottom line, until we get their 990s later on. Probably 2026, you'll start to see this 2025 990s come out, and that will be a real, because the 2024 990s are useful, but they're going to be all election related, information in there. And so you won't see the impact of things like Trump's election and the passage of this tax cut on the fundraising of these groups until, in writing on paper. I will say, I guess going along with that, the other thing you can look for is like, if a group is doing really well, right, they tend to want to talk about that. If a group is breaking fundraising records, they'll go out and tell you that they're breaking fundraising records most of the time, because then that will, the hope is to snowball it into more enthusiasm, more people. Oh, Everytown's raised more money than it's ever raised. There's more donors this year than ever before. Well, I should donate too. That's so. If you're not seeing a lot of that, that could be potentially indicative that it's not quite as much of a bonanza as it could be.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. Yeah, I agree.
All right, next question here. And some of these, I think you'll see similar effects when we're going to talk here now a little bit about the gun market, because we got a couple questions from Rob that relate to this. But so he says, in my view, the last 5 years, we have seen suppressor sales skyrocket and new manufacturers enter the market. With the tax going to zero, what are your thoughts on established manufacturers getting into suppressor market? And what is the outlook for new manufacturers to produce pistols, SPRs, SPSs with suppressors from the manufacturer? So this gets into the potential market effects of these tax cuts. And we actually just had a whole interview podcast with Open Source Defense, the co-founders of that, on the show, Kareem and Chuck. And I thought they had some really good insight into more details of what we should expect in this regard. And I would definitely direct people to listen to that whole podcast if they want more on that. But I would generally say that I expect to see, more supply in the market. I think you'll see more established companies and more startup, new companies come in to make silencers and suppressors, potentially even at, mass production scale. Because the problem you've had for suppressors over the last almost 100 years since the NFA was passed is that is the tax. There's two. It's a twofold problem, right? There's the tax, which adds a financial burden. Now that's in the beginning was basically a insurmountable financial burden for most people who weren't wealthy, basically. But over time, inflation has cut away at how much of a burden it is financially for the average person, to the point where, most middle class people are more than comfortable to be able to buy a suppressor. But the other half of it is the registration process, and mostly, yes, there are plenty of people who have sort of an ideological or political philosophy objection to registering any sort of gun or device with the government. But I think for most people, the registration process has been a deterrent because of the time suck involved in it. It could, for the longest time, it could take 9 months to a year, or in the worst case scenario, even longer than a year for your registration to get processed. And in that time, you can't possess your item. Like, you can't take your gun or suppressor home with you. You have to leave it with the FFL. And so that was another part that was a big burden. In fact, that's what you'll hear a lot of people, why they're upset about the way this all played out, is they didn't consider the money part as much of a burden as the registration part. Now, I will say, while those complaints are understandable, it's actually become much less of a problem, that part of it, recently, because the ATF has digitized a lot of this registration process and really sped up the processing there to where it can be a couple of days. I've even heard, maybe even faster than that, hours. Like, you're getting closer to NICS level, National Instant Criminal Background Check System level of processing speed. Whether that'll hold when demand goes up is another question, and especially with some of the proposed ATF budget cuts that you just did some reporting on. But at the end of the day, that was was constraining the market. This $200 tax on every single suppressor being sold, and this long registration time. If both of those things go down to the point where they're almost not a burden at all anymore, there's still a process there. You like submit your fingerprints and whatever, but companies like Silencer Shop have made that really easy to do, right? Or Silencer Central. There's been a number of companies that have innovated to make the process a lot less burdensome. And so that, I think, up to this point, you've seen suppressors have to stay in this higher end part of the market because they're limited at how much product they can really move. And so if it turns out to be you can really start to move a lot more of these suppressors, millions a year, then I think you see a lot more people getting into making them. I mean, a lot of the major companies are already in this, right? As I mentioned, it's been ramping up for a couple of years, for years now, probably the last decade or so. It's really been ramping up. You're seeing big SIG makes suppressors. It's not just suppressor specific companies like Silencer Co. anymore in the market. And I think you'll see a lot more of that. I think you'll see a lot of interesting innovation in materials and production process. It's a relatively simple device, right? Like, it's a tube with some baffles in it. Now, there's all kinds of engineering that can go into the design of the baffles and how, there's fluid dynamics at play and all stuff beyond my capacity. But the product itself there's no moving parts, right? It's a pretty straightforward thing to produce. And I think with these burdens, these hurdles to ownership being significantly reduced, if not totally removed, if maybe GOA or the NRA wins their lawsuit and the regulations go away altogether, that could happen. But even if it doesn't, I'd expect to see a lot more competition in the market, and that'll drive down costs for consumers most likely.
Yeah, the only one caveat I would say to that is depending on how much demand we see increase in the aftermath of something like this, and two, whether or not it becomes a political sort of hot button issue as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could also see a lot of states start trying to renew a renewed push to ban these in a lot of blue states too. That could impact the market as well. I mean, you've already got a number of states where that's the case. And those outright bans are probably more vulnerable to Second Amendment challenges than the NFA itself, too. I mean, we've seen that in the DOJ's latest position on silencers and the NFA, that they, even the DOJ is arguing, well, they're protected by the Second Amendment, but the NFA is just a tax and registration scheme, so it's not enough of a burden to be unconstitutional. However, that implies that perhaps the total bans would be unconstitutional, and I think you would have a better case there. Not that these cases, not to prejudge the GOA NRA cases that they're going to lose this NFA challenge. I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's just a ban under this current jurisprudence of the Second Amendment is a higher burden, obviously, than a tax and registration scheme is. Not that means that any tax and registration scheme could withstand scrutiny, because that's not necessarily the case. All right, but and same thing for SBRs and SBSs, and I will say, like, for me, when this came down, when this tax came through, my first thought is, I would really like to have an integrally suppressed SBR, short barrel rifle, like AR, for home defense. Like, I have a regular semi-automatic 16-inch barrel AR for home defense. What's better than that for home defense? An AR with a shorter barrel and a suppressor on it, because you can navigate tight corners easier with a shorter barrel. You're not looking to shoot super long distances anyway. And instead of when someone's breaking into your house or whatever deadly threat situation you're pulling out your gun for, instead of trying to remember to put on your hearing protection, you have a suppressed rifle. That's it's not a necessity to protect your hearing in a life or death situation, but it's preferable to do it. So anyway, that was my first thought, and so yeah, I could see demand for that happening. The only thing that undercuts it is that people have been buying pistol braced guns for years as an alternative, and so they may not think it's necessary to upgrade to a full stock if the pistol brace works just as well for them. But we will see what happens, and we will certainly follow that. Similarly, we have a follow-up here with Rob that gets into more industry questions or market questions here. During the first Trump presidency, we saw firearm demand subside to the point that companies like Bushmaster and Remington declared bankruptcy. With no new threats to firearm ownership, how do you think this will impact the firearm industry? Do you see consolidation in the form of Anderson Manufacturing being purchased by Ruger being a new norm, or do you see Ruger's new Glock-style pistols, the RXM, and Smith & Wesson getting back into the lever action section, and Henry creating special products division as something that we'll see more of? So will product innovation save the industry, or what should we expect to see market-wise there? Why don't you take a shot at that first?
Sure, yeah. Well, we've already sort of been covering stories about slumping gun sales throughout this Trump's return to the White House. So you've sort of seen the demand subside once again, like we saw the first Trump administration. So that he's spot on there, and I expect that to continue as well. Quite frankly, I don't necessarily know something like the NFA tax cut being enough to sort of buffer that. I don't think we're going to see that much demand. His point about consolidation is interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more of that, particularly the small manufacturers that really relied on, like Anderson in particular was known for, whenever an AR ban was being floated, people would half jokingly put out things like, well, I'm going to buy 5 cheap Anderson lowers just in case they ban ARs so that I can make them in the future. It was sort of the go-to, buy quickly in case of ban sort of company. And now that the threat or the perceived threat is no longer there to some folks, obviously you see companies like that struggle. So perhaps you'll see more consolidation where smaller players get bought up by the bigger companies that can kind of ride out the slump in demand.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we were talking about as far as the gun groups and fundraising is concerned. Like, another similar effect is if gun owners are not concerned, there's not going to be panic buying necessarily, because the perception, right? Whether the perception matches reality is another question, but the perception, and I think at this point, it's a fair perception, is that there's much less likely, and that it's much less likely new bans on guns are going to come down from the federal level. And so there's that motivation to rush out and buy guns is not going to be there. And that could lead to a depression in demand. And yes, we are seeing lower sales numbers. Now, they're not falling dramatically, but they are continually declining. And we've been seeing that for 5 years now. Because one thing you should note about the first Trump term is that it was 3 years of sales declining significantly, and then 1 year of wild surge to all-time highs. But that was because of all of the chaos of 2020 that we saw. So not necessarily, that was COVID, then the murder of George Floyd, which sent people to buy guns in reaction to the murder itself, and then we saw rioting associated with the protests of the George Floyd's murder, and that sent people go to buy guns. So 2020, and then you had a presidential election between two candidates who had polar opposite views on gun regulation, and so it was sort of a perfect storm as far as motivating all kinds of people from a lot of different backgrounds and points of view to go and buy guns. And so, that could happen again. Donald Trump's, a fairly chaotic president, and we've seen a lot of that. Obviously, most of that stuff was, and I don't want to say completely outside of his control, but it wasn't, these were things that were outside forces that really drove much of the chaos that motivated people to go and buy guns at record levels. One thing I would note too is, like, one theory coming out of 2020 is you saw a lot of new gun owners. There's millions of new gun owners. You even saw that was reflected in a lot of data in, like, California's registration numbers. There was a study of that showed, yes, there were new gun owners from diverse backgrounds, and you saw public polling indicate that gun ownership rate had increased at least a little bit, a couple points. And so the thought was, well, you're probably going to come down from this surge of demand, and you're going to find a new floor. That's how the market usually works for guns. It's a feast famine business, and you get a surge of demand and then a decline back down, and usually the floor levels out somewhere above where the old normal was. And the thought was all these new gun owners coming into the market is going to mean that happens again this time. And one thing that, I've become increasingly skeptical of that over the last couple of years here, because we keep seeing we're not seeing that floor. We've seen a couple of false floors. I think now it's like, well, I don't know, is the industry really, have they been able to turn these new gun owners into lifetime gun owners who come back into buy second, third guns? Maybe they haven't been able to do that. Something is keeping the sales levels relatively depressed, and you would expect from here to see that even more so under a second Trump administration, unless you get some sort of chaotic thing that is going to motivate people to go out and buy guns like the pandemic did or like the rioting did. But those are obviously not things I think anyone wants to root for to see. So instead, the industry should be looking at, how can we recapture these customers that came in during the pandemic and haven't turned into, enthusiasts or hobbyists. But anyway, to get to the bottom of the question there, I doubt that innovation in new products is going to reverse the trend. Maybe. I doubt that the NFA items becoming more readily available is going to reverse the trend either. Like, that's more of you're getting people who are already enthusiasts to go and buy another firearm rather than bringing in new people necessarily, sort of situation. And then I would say, yeah, you're probably going to see, if that trend does continue down, if the decline doesn't even out at some point here, and you start seeing year over year improvements in gun sales numbers, you probably are going to start to see more of these smaller companies or companies on the brink go bankrupt, and maybe they'll get acquired by one of the larger manufacturers. I mean, I'm sure not Smith & Wesson and Ruger probably, I don't think they have any signs that they're going to, be in financial stress anytime soon. And I doubt that the decline is going to be, it's not going to be a giant drop off, but it may be just a slow, continual slope down. And that could go on for years, because not political considerations are not the only things that motivate people to buy guns, obviously, but they have been a major factor the last 15 to 20 years. And they're not, that's unlikely to happen as much over the next four years here. But all right, next question here. And this is a NRA question from Rob. And he said, you were at NRA annual meeting in Atlanta. Do you think the NRA can get back to the pre-pandemic levels of membership? And why do you think that? And, sorry, I'm getting a little mixed up here. What's standing in their way? So I think it's possible to get back to where they were, back to the 5.25 million member mark. I think last good estimate I saw was they're somewhere around 3 million right now, which is still quite a lot. It's still the largest by a large, as far as dues paying members, people who have paid to be NRA members either on a lifetime membership. That does keep the numbers somewhat inflated, I think, because they're not those people aren't necessarily paying in continually. They bought a one-time lifetime membership, and they might not be still giving. But the bottom line is, when you look at membership numbers, a lot of groups will claim millions of members in the gun space, but most of those groups on either side that make those claims are talking about like email lists or Facebook likes, stuff like that, instead of people who have paid to be a member. And I think that's a significant distinction. So just to be clear on like why you'll hear a lot of other gun groups claim millions of members, but it's not quite the same dynamic, because the NRA's members are people who actually paid the NRA to be members. So it's sort of the difference between like a Reload member and a Reload free subscribers. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a different level of involvement that it indicates. And so regardless, they're still really big, and they still have a lot of money they can use. And they should actually, as we talked about earlier this year, when looking at their finances after the NRA annual meeting, they should have some significant cash flow open up, because they've finally gotten on the other side of their corruption lawsuit in New York. And so they should have some resources to work with to try and at least stop the bleeding. I think that's their top priority, is to try and stop members from leaving, right? Try to retain the members they still have, and then they can hopefully grow from there. I think it'll be a long haul to get back. It's certainly possible, if they can convince even just their former members that they've cleaned things up, that they're making that they offer a compelling value proposition, right? Like, what do you get for your NRA membership? Because a lot of people, that's another consideration. Like, the NRA is different from a lot of gun groups in the fact that it offers a lot of stuff beyond political activism, right? Like, they're the largest gun safety organization in the country as far as like certifying instructors go. I'm a NRA certified instructor, because that's the most common and most widely recognized certification for gun instruction. And they do competitions, they do youth shooting programs, they do all this stuff. And when you join the NRA, you also traditionally you've gotten like discounts at certain places. Now that a lot of that got cut off post Parkland, but the point is there you get a magazine, you get a bunch of, you'll get some sort of bag or something usually when you sign up. People go and sign up for an NRA membership, not just because they believe in the cause of gun rights, but often because it's also like something that they get additional value out of. You might need to do it to join the local shooting club. In the past, that's been a big thing, or to get into a gun show. You buy a membership that's $15, you get into the gun show that would otherwise cost $10 or whatever. So you get the idea here. They have to make sure that their value proposition is appealing to the people they're trying to get to be members, and they have to show that the money that's spent isn't going to some luxurious lifestyle for the executives of the nonprofit, right? And those are not easy things to do, right? To convince people who lost trust in you that you've fixed things and turned it around, but it's not impossible. They haven't gone bankrupt. I mean, they did technically file for bankruptcy, which adds another level of like, they got to remind people, oh, we're not actually bankrupt. If you give us your money, it's not, they've made a lot of mistakes. Let's say that much about the NRA over the last several decades, but especially the last 5 years. And so it's a hard climb. And I do think it'll probably take, the NRA got to that 5 million member level because of Sandy Hook and the political backlash that the attempts to enact universal background checks and new gun restrictions on the federal level brought in a lot of members at that point. And you might need something like that, you need to reestablish the basics, and then you're probably still going to need some sort of high profile moment where the NRA is at the center of it, and the people who agree with their point of view rally around them. But it's probably going to take years to get back to anything close to their peak in terms of membership.
Yeah, and just their visibility, as we saw with the recent activity on the Hill with the NFA tax cut. NRA was involved, but they certainly weren't the leading player like they have been in past political fights over.
Not in the public sphere. Yeah. They may have been doing a little more behind the scenes, but if that's the case, right, they have to be able to go out and translate that to their members. Like, we were the ones who were the adults in the room that got what we were able to get. That sort of, they have to go out and show it, which we haven't seen much of. They may well have been more active behind the scenes than is publicly known at this point. But if you don't advertise that, if you don't show that that's or prove that you were doing that, people aren't going to know. All right, next question here. Paul, as a long-suffering New York State resident, I was bitterly disappointed that the Supreme Court denied cert in Snope v. Brown. My question is, when looking ahead, what might be the one case that reaches the Supreme Court that will give us another shot at putting down these hardware bans? So Snope v. Brown was the Maryland assault weapons ban case that the court declined to take up. There were three votes there were three dissents from that decision. All three of them conservative justices. But you need four to take up a case. And I will say this one I think is pretty straightforward in that I don't know a specific case that I would give here, but I can say that obviously there was a fourth person who commented on the Snope denial, and that's the most important one, and that was Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who wrote a statement which implies that he voted against taking up the case. But at the end of the statement, and his statement more or less lays out the position that he would overturn the lower court ruling and find Maryland's assault weapons ban unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. That was certainly the implication of his statement, I thought. However, at the end of the statement, he discusses how there's a lot of cases, a lot of similar cases on assault weapons bans and magazine capacity limits, and he was saying that the court could benefit from further percolation in lower courts, and he made a very definitive statement where he said he expects the court will take up a similar case, some sort of assault weapons ban or hardware ban case in the next year or two, or I think he said the next session or two, but that would be a year or two. And so I think that there's a lot of ways to read that. Perhaps you could read it as him kind of speaking for, even though they didn't sign on, nobody else signed on to his statement, but maybe he's speaking for Roberts and Barrett, who were the other two conservatives that didn't dissent on the denial, who so presumably wouldn't vote to take up the case. Or you could read it as him speaking to them, saying, hey, we need to get our ducks in a row as to what we think of these laws, because I'm going to be the fourth vote here in the next year or two. So I wouldn't give you a specific case, but I would say the timetable has been pretty well established by Kavanaugh's comments. Right? I don't know. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, not that there's any certainty with specific cases, but maybe a couple of potential contenders might be when the Seventh Circuit's ruling comes up on final merits decision. That's the one that they previously denied, where Thomas wrote his first statement on assault weapon bans, where he basically said, I think these are unconstitutional and we should take this up if the Seventh Circuit continues. And the reason I think that is because the Seventh Circuit one, its rationale, I think, was particularly thin, shall we say. That's the one where the panel said that, they're basically M16s and machine guns can be banned, therefore assault weapon bans are okay. And I think that's a particularly thin approach to trying to apply Bruin to modern hardware bans, and that might be something that entices the court to take it up. And then the other thing to watch for is, we mentioned this in a news update podcast a couple weeks back, but the Third Circuit just heard a case on New Jersey's assault weapon ban. And the reason that one's interesting is maybe not necessarily the panel, but the Third Circuit is a little more conservative leaning of a circuit than all the others to consider an assault weapon ban. And if we do get a circuit decision that actually strikes down an assault weapon ban and creates a circuit split on the question, I think then that becomes a real inducement into the Supreme Court to take it up. But that's obviously speculative. We don't know that's going to happen. It's just a potential factor to watch out for in the coming year or two.
Yep. So those are I think the best specific cases to watch for sure. But I think the timetable has been pretty well established by Kavanaugh. There's already clearly 3 votes to take up a case like this. He's basically saying, I will be the 4th vote in the next year or two. Maybe I'm okay to wait for another, for these cases to move a little more in the lower courts. But as Thomas pointed out in his dissent, I mean, they've been waiting like a decade to do, they could have probably just done this right after Heller. It's certainly what a lot of gun rights activists had wanted, but I don't know that the questions are all that different between Heller and here, but maybe some of the justices disagree on that point, and so that's why we haven't seen it happen yet. All right, next question here. Irwin writes, what will the Solicitor General's office do in McCoy? And then I guess these kind of go together. What will the government's position be on all these 18 to 20-year-old state cases that are seeking cert, including Lara and Glass? So, age restrictions have been a big topic of debate in the lower courts to this point around, when do the Second Amendment rights vest, essentially. And there's a lot of federal and state restrictions on those under 21, whether it comes to when it comes to buying handguns, for instance, or any guns at all in Florida's case, or when it comes to carrying guns, like the Lara case in Pennsylvania. And we've seen some interesting developments here, like the McCoy case, right? That was the one where the DOJ decided not to appeal when they lost that case. And
well, that's not the McCoy case. That's the Reese case. Reese case out of
That's
the Fifth
Reese.
Circuit is the one that they decided not to appeal. But the McCoy case is one where gun rights advocates lost their challenge in the Fourth Circuit, and they're appealing it.
That's the sister case, I would say, where the Fifth Circuit DOJ said we're not going to appeal our loss here on the federal ban on licensed gun dealers selling handguns to those under 21. However, which was an interesting move, right? We wrote about that. They haven't explained why they've decided to go that route. So we don't quite know. There's, you can speculate they had written one of those briefs that they've written in a lot of cases where they reference President Trump's executive order on, ensuring that the DOJ is taking pro Second Amendment positions. But they never really explain the logic to why they decided not to appeal the case. But it's especially interesting because, there's another case, McCoy in the Fourth Circuit, where the gun rights activists lost and the government won. And so if the goal was to avoid taking this to the Supreme Court, well, it's probably not going to happen because now there's a circuit split and the gun rights advocates are going to appeal it, right?
Yep. This kind of creates a situation where the DOJ, in theory anyway, will have to take a position one way or the other on whether they think that federal law is constitutional in a response brief to this petition. I guess in theory they could just say, hey, we're not going to defend this. There's precedent for the DOJ doing that with federal law, but they haven't indicated one way or another. When I was doing some reporting on the previous decision not to appeal the case, Andrew Willinger, who's a firearms law expert over at Duke, he sort of speculated that just based on watching the DOJ's behavior here, that they don't want to take the step of arguing to dismantle their own federal laws, and that they may try to, as these other state challenges are working their way up to the Supreme Court as well, they may try to angle and argue for a state case being taken up, having the Supreme Court's vehicle for addressing young adult issues be a state case. So that way they can argue that, the state laws are the ones that are constitutionally infirm. So that doesn't put them in the awkward position one way or the other of taking a position on their own federal gun laws.
And we've noticed that that trend in a number of cases, because the DOJ has gone out of its way to get involved in several state gun law challenges that just don't involve the federal government at all. But when it comes to some of these federal laws, they have often defended, like they defended the NFA, even though they softened their position on silencers and suppressors and whether they're protected by the Second Amendment, they still defended the NFA. And so they've been more inclined to define federal law. And this kind of goes into Erwin's next question here, actually. Is DOJ taking steps to concede error in the appellate courts so the Supreme Court does not have to deal with cases where the United States is the litigant? And so that's kind of goes to Reese. Like, are they willing to, lose and not appeal these lower court cases so that they don't end up at the Supreme Court and create a nationwide precedent?
They've done it twice so far. Yeah. Reese and Range. So
yeah. And Range, but Range is gives us a little more insight too than Reese, because in Range, after they decided not to appeal that case, which was the nonviolent felon, the guy who had lied on food stamp application about his income and pled guilty to a state misdemeanor, but it qualifies as a felony under federal law. And so he's been unable to own guns. And so he won his as applied challenge at the Third Circuit. And DOJ decided not to appeal that case, even though I think gun rights advocates probably would have liked to see that one at the Supreme Court, honestly. But they then went and explained that decision to Congress, right?
Yeah, they wrote a letter that wasn't widely publicized, but it got out and we reported on it, where they explained to the Senate Judiciary Committee that, hey, we don't think that this is worth the Supreme Court's time, because even though it questioned federal law, it was only very, very narrowly, and we don't think it's going to cause a bunch of ruffles. And we have this new process now, this firearms rights restoration process that Pam Bondi started. And we think that'll handle these issues going forward. We think Range would have qualified anyway under that standard. So we're just going to leave it alone. And then they proceeded to basically make the same argument in multiple federal felon in possession cert petitions that have been percolating throughout the country. So they're sticking to that line.
they don't think that the federal felon in possession law is unconstitutional. Essentially, they're still saying that it's it is constitutional in their Second Amendment, and that they also, I think, directly just claim that they don't think that the Third Circuit was right in its reasoning, but they didn't want to appeal it anyway. So, in that case, while they didn't appeal, they also didn't come around to the view that the law is unconstitutional. And so that may also be what they're doing in Reese, and what's happening in McCoy will let us know, because they're going to have to. I believe they'll have to respond to that. So we'll see what they do, what they say once that happens. And then last question here is one in your wheelhouse, Jake, because it deals with your home state. This is from Sam, and he asks, when is the expected time frame for Colorado's AG to release the permit to purchase list? Which guns are going to be impacted essentially under the new law, or for Colorado's DOW to release permit training costs and requirements?
Yeah, so expected time frame. This is going to be probably an unsatisfying answer to you, Sam, but the text of the bill does not actually give a time frame for when the Attorney General needs to come up with something, or when Colorado Parks and Wildlife is supposed to have this training course up and running, and the broad outline of it ready to go. This bill, Senate Bill 3, is what he's talking about, which is what banned semi-automatic firearms that accept attachable magazines and gas-operated handguns, and all sort of a convoluted way to do an assault weapon ban, essentially.
It's an assault weapon ban by another name, basically.
Right. But with the carve-out for this new permit to purchase scheme, that doesn't go into effect until August 1st, 2026. So there's still more than a year's time for them to, in theory, come up with this sort of stuff. The text of the bill doesn't give them a timeline for it. It also doesn't specify a cap on the amount they can charge for this training course. Doesn't give a cap for how long it can take to issue your training certification and your eligibility card that you have to get from a sheriff to even take that training course. So there's a lot of details that still need to be sort of ironed out, and no real definitive guidelines as to when gun owners in Colorado are going to get those details.
Yeah, and that's they moved to this permit to purchase scheme over a straight up sales ban, like you've seen in most other states that have enacted these kind of policies, and that probably makes the law overall less vulnerable to constitutional challenges, post Bruin, because Bruin more or less it blessed at least shall issue permitting for gun carry, but because it put gun carry and gun ownership on the same constitutional plane, the implication, at least now, the Supreme Court has not ruled on any permit to purchase laws, but the implication is if you have a shall issue permitting scheme for ownership, it may also be constitutional. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Colorado went this direction instead of an outright sales ban. Of course, the one thing the Supreme Court also made clear in Bruin is that while you can have a permitting system, it can become unconstitutional, even a shall issue one, if the permitting fees are too outrageous or the process is too onerous by design for most people to go through. And so that's I think gun rights activists in the state are going to be keeping their eye on. And it does seem like with the requirements they have, it's probably going to be a pretty expensive process to actually complete. We'll have to see. We won't get the details for a while, right?
Right. And one other thing to keep an eye on is just the actual rollout of this permit to purchase system. Colorado's never had one before in the past. They're tasking it to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which doesn't have any experience in this field. They handle like hunter safety education, so I guess that's somewhat related, but that's not even close to the same thing that the law requires them to do. And if listeners will recall, when Oregon's permit to purchase law went into effect via ballot measure a couple of years back, they actually had to delay implementation of that because it took them so long to get a valid permit to purchase system up and running, and it actually took longer than the deadline of that measure gave them. So they had to kick that back a while before they could actually set up a system. So, maybe a year's time will be enough for a brand new agency to, from the ground up, create a new system, but maybe not. So that's another thing to watch as well. Just bureaucratic sort of bloat and difficulties.
I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out a similar way as the Oregon debacle, and we will certainly continue to keep our eye on it, and you'll be there in the state as it unfolds. So yeah, we'll watch out. I wish we had a more satisfying answer, a more definitive answer, but there just isn't a timetable, and there aren't any details yet, and they don't have to provide any details for like another year. So we'll see how it goes. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. I think we've answered all the questions that came in. And so if you want to submit a question for the next Q&A podcast, and you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and news reporting that you won't find anywhere else, and you want to support the work that we do here at The Reload, you can head over to thereload.com and buy a membership today. If you're not ready to make that leap, you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Most of our reporting is in front of the paywall. We like to keep that out there and inform as many people as possible, while also balancing the need to operate and be able to fund the reporting that we're doing here. So go over there and check it out today. See what you like about it. Give a taste of the reporting that we do, and see if you're able and willing to support that work with a membership. But that's all we've got for you this week. We will see you guys again real soon.